State-sanctioned torture is justifiable in extenuating circumstances. I'm speaking on the proposition, and I want you to have a slight listen to this story and tell me what you think about it. You live in London. It's a massive city, as you know, and you are a government official, and you've been told that there's an imminent terrorist attack, and you have credible intelligence that there is a dirty bomb with possible biological agents within it that is set to go off at noon tomorrow in Westminster. As a government official, you have been tasked with the job of getting the information out of the bomb maker to find out what exactly you need to do to disarm this bomb. And as a state official, you have been given the freedom to do whatever it takes in order to disarm this bomb. What would you do? Would you torture him? Would you torture him to save the lives of 1,000 people? Or 10,000 people? For the lives of all the public officials and the leaders of the state? If it was your duty, and you had the ability to save those people from certain death, would you do it as a government official? We're not talking about just torturing for the sake of torturing or acquiring random bits of information. We're talking about extreme extenuating circumstances such as a bomb is going off in Westminster tomorrow at noon. The proposition is going to argue 3 points. First, the state is obliged to protect its citizens. Second, the ends do justify the means in this situation. And third, state-sanctioned torture is a feature of antiquity and remains still because it is effective. Our first point, the state is obliged to protect its citizens. As a state official of a state, you are responsible for the well-being and security of the state. That is and its citizens. That is the purpose of having a state, to protect the citizens of it. You are giving them this benefit of protection in exchange for them to pay tax money to allow you to do such services. If you are unable to do that, then what is the point of the state to exist if you can't protect them from that bomb going off in Westminster? There isn't. Your job, you are obliged as a modern state to protect them. Second, the ends justify the means. You, singularly, as a state official, would be saving the lives of thousands to tens of thousands of people from death or pain and injury. It would be you as a person of this, as a citizen of the state, working for the state, saving these people, and you wouldn't do something slightly immoral that the state has told you was okay because of what? Because you want all these people to die? Would you rather them die, and you have the ability to stop them, than to commit an act that is justified by the state that causes injury onto one person to save the lives of 10,000 people? If you look at it from a cost-benefit analysis, it doesn't make any sense not to. And finally, state-sanctioned torture has been a feature of antiquity. We've seen it all throughout history: ancient, medieval, modern, our current history. There's not been a period in history that there has not been torture committed by the state. And they've done so since antiquity. Because it is effective, it is useful, it achieves the end goal. You want this piece of information in this extreme circumstance because you've gone through all possible options already, and therefore you're resorting to torture as a last resort. It's not something you first go to, it's your last resort. If it hadn't worked all these years, surely it would have gone out. We've only gotten better at doing it. So therefore, I just want you to remember that if there was a bomb, and it was your job as a government official to find out any possible way to stop that bomb from going off, you would torture him. It would save the lives of tens of thousands of people just to stop them from dying. One man's injury is surely worth the cost of saving all those lives. Thank you.
I want to bring you 2 arguments today. I firstly want to say why torturing in any circumstance is a dereliction of the state's duty and represents a failure of the state's duty not to torture. Secondly, I want to talk about the harmful messages that torturing in any circumstance says, even if it's strictly extreme. One point of rebuttal first. Our last speaker told us that torture is okay because we've done it since antiquity. Rome did it, Alexander the Great did it, therefore it's okay. This argument also probably applies to things like ethnic cleansing, like slavery, and like burning witches. These are also things that have been done since antiquity. It doesn't make them a good idea. Indeed, like torture, all these things were actually both morally wrong and counterproductive in the long run, which are both things I'm going to show about torture. So firstly, why it's morally wrong. Because it's a failure of the state's duty not to torture. So, what we think is important on this side of the house is that there's a presumption of innocence for all people. And especially the example that the proposition talked about was someone who is suspected of a crime, but has not yet been convicted of being a terrorist and is being tortured on the basis of intelligence and suspicion. Because we actually do agree with the proposition. We do think that the state has a duty to everyone and a duty to protect everyone. But we think this extends to everyone who hasn't been convicted of a crime yet, to everyone who is still assumed to be innocent. As far as we're concerned, the state still has a duty to protect that suspected terrorist from torture, and if it tortures him themselves, the state's obviously failing in its duty to protect them from being tortured. We think that's incredibly important. Even if this terrorist is actually, guilty in the real sense of they did do the crime, until they have been convicted, and even after they're convicted, if this is a state that says it doesn't torture, as usual, the state has the duty to uphold the right of that person before they're convicted and after they're convicted not to be tortured, because that is the stance that the state has taken. Remember that torture is incredibly harmful to an individual. We're talking about ripping out fingernails, or waterboarding, or any of the other harmful things which can have massive physical and mental damage to a person. The state has this is the reason the state takes a stand against torture in general. You can't try and stand up against torture in general and say, but we're willing to be in favor of it in some circumstances, because then it's failing the right of that person to be protected from it. Therefore, we think it is wrong to torture that person, and it represents a betrayal of that. It undermines the trust that we all put in the state, where we assume the state will live up to its promises and not make extreme, exceptional circumstances for us and betray our rights in those circumstances. That harms the perception of the state and represents a betrayal of what the state should stand for. Second argument I want to bring you is about the harmful messages that torturing sends out. Because what we think is that you can argue that maybe torture isn't intrinsically different to other things we do. Maybe torture isn't unique. Maybe you could argue it's the same as prison, or it's similar to prison. Whether or not that's true, and we don't think it is, we think torture probably is different because of the huge harms it comes about, which I just talked about. Even if torture were sort of intrinsically the same, the important thing to remember is that torture is perceived as being different by almost everyone in the world. So whether or not it's the same, people think it's different, and as a consequence, when you start torturing people, they react differently than to what you put people in prison with. So it's that message and how people react to that message that's incredibly important. Because we think that in terms of saying, there are extreme circumstances that justify this, or this can happen, we think the problem is that people still perceive this as a massive violation of a person's human rights. They still see this as something that's being done wrong, which is why they wouldn't allow the state to do it in general. And there are two harmful messages that this sends out. The first harmful message this sends out is to anyone who empathizes with that terrorist. And we think a lot of people are likely to empathize because they see something that they think is intrinsically wrong being done to him. They see it as a violation of the right which the state says normally everyone has. This is especially pernicious when we talk about terrorist groups that tend to have communities that sympathize with them, or sympathize with some of their goals or some of their grievances. When you start torturing members of these communities and treating them as less than human, treating them as not deserving the rights the state says everybody has, that can lead to entire communities feeling singled out by the state, which is more likely to drive things like terrorism and make them at least less likely to help the state, less likely to inform on terrorist suspects, which means you catch fewer terrorists in the first place, and in the long run, you undermine your own security. More of your citizens die when you lose these communities. Secondly, this sends a message to other states in the world, because currently, the UK has a certain amount of moral high ground it can use to restrain its allies abroad and say you can't do things like torture because we think it's wrong. When the UK starts doing this, it legitimizes other nations doing it in their own extreme circumstances. The problem is that we are allied with some nations which we may be able to restrain from torturing, but which, if they were allowed to torture in extreme circumstances, would define extreme circumstances to mean things like protesting against the state, or other things we don't think torture would be used for. The UK loses its ability to condemn these things when the UK tortures for its own reasons. Other people can say, our reasons are as valid as yours, you can't tell us not to. Therefore, we think this sends out a harmful message to other states too, leading to more torture in those states, which we think is bad. Therefore, for the reason that torture is always wrong, even in extenuating circumstances, and for the counterproductive and harmful messages it sends out, we are very proud to oppose torturing in any circumstance, even extreme ones. Thank you.
We have one key point to make to you today in extending the proposition side's argument. And this point trades off of something that Jordan noted in rebuttal to a point that Dinah made. It's a very important point, although it is relatively minor, so we'll go back over it again for you. Jordan said that Dinah's highlighting of the historical role of coercive interrogation, of the historical use of force by the state against its enemies, against those who threatened its citizens, doesn't necessarily justify the continued use of similar amounts of force today. We would argue that this is entirely justified. We would concede that Jordan's observation is entirely correct. The previous use of torture, use of coercive interrogation by people such as Alexander of Macedon, for example, doesn't necessarily justify its use by modern states, but it provides crucial clues as to the way that modern states, as to the way that states and individuals who act as agents for those states choose to respond to threatening and stressful situations. It provides crucial clues to the way in which those stressful situations affect the monopoly of force that states have. And this is what we're going to focus on in our arguments today. First point of substantive. Let's take a look at the sorts of environments where these atrocities, where terrorist attacks happen. In the context of Western liberal democracies, terrorist attacks are vanishingly rare. Although incidents such as 9/11, such as 7/7, and the Madrid bombings were significant in scale, we still see terrorist atrocities claiming more lives and happening more frequently in places such as, for example, Iraq during 2004-2005, in Mexico, in many areas of Southeast Asia. Why is this relevant? Well, very frequently we mount interdictions in these areas. We go into places like Afghanistan, we go into places like Iraq in order to make them safer, in order to remove the threat that's posed by the complicity between the regimes in those countries and terrorist organisations, and also in order to ensure that terrorists can't operate in those areas. Now, very frequently, this also means that there is a correlative rise in terrorist attacks. Even in states that we're allied with, areas such as Saudi Arabia, the very fact that those states choose to ally themselves with large and wealthy Western liberal democratic powers means that they become the targets of terrorism. Why is this problematic? Well, it means, first of all, that you see a very high instance of terrorism in these areas. You see terrorists seeking out deliberately to attack these places for their alliances and because they have weaker security infrastructure. This correspondingly weakens the sort of democratic states, the developing democratic states that we're trying to build up there. It means that the entire project of democracy and development itself fails. Why is this problematic, and why can't we resolve it using the sorts of techniques we deploy in a Western liberal state? Well, we simply don't have the resources. We don't have developed concepts such as the rule of law. We don't have developed police forces. We don't have the reliable tools of civil society that let us track and detect criminals. We don't have those norms of behaviour in place. What does this mean? How do we respond to this? Well, in order to keep people safe, it's necessary, even if it isn't always intended, to deploy coercive tactics. Sometimes it's necessary for an interrogator, in the agony of the moment, to strike the person he's interrogating. Sometimes it's necessary to use humiliation, to use other tactics in order to coerce information out of somebody, when it means that dozens, hundreds, thousands of Iraqis or Afghani citizens could be saved from being attacked by terrorists, from being attacked by suicide bombers. This is simply an example of the necessary pragmatism that underlies any sort of foreign policy engagement. We've been prepared in other instances to turn a blind eye to the actions of allies in these areas when it comes to using coercive tactics, when it comes to not following the strictest standards of procedure when detaining, for instance, terrorist suspects. And this is simply a function of the fact that the political situation in these areas is never entirely perfect. We would argue, therefore, that even though it's never acceptable when endorsed by a state, even though it's never acceptable when a state consciously says that as an aspect of its policy, as an aspect of the way it responds to these problems, it will endorse torture, sometimes we have to acknowledge that torture occurs, and sometimes we have to acknowledge that the information produced by coercive interrogation can actually be useful, both in preventing attacks in states outside of the sphere of Western democratic influence, and also in detecting the possibility of further attacks against Western liberal democracies. We have to understand that sometimes the agony of the moment, the scale of the danger, those ticking time bomb scenarios that Dinah discussed, do present a compelling case for somebody to be coerced in the course of interrogation. Permanent harm might not be acceptable to these individuals. Out and out torture for punishment's sake might not be acceptable. But when it comes to extracting information, and when it's supervised by trained individuals, trained interrogators, individuals from military forces, we think that it's the lesser of two evils. We're very proud to propose.
Okay, so firstly, I'm going to rebut the previous speaker's claim that terrorists should in some way expect to be tortured, that they should in some way expect that their actions lead to diabolical punishments. Secondly, I'm going to rebut his claim that we should empathise with military army men in stressful circumstances operating in the field. And thirdly, I'm going to put all morality aside and talk about the practical implications of state-sanctioned torture and how those make the whole notion completely unworkable. So, going back to the previous speaker's claim that terrorists are in some way asking to be tortured if they get caught. This is the same as saying that women in short skirts walking down the street at night are asking to be raped. Somebody who rapes a woman in a short skirt is still responsible for his crime. The women's clothes don't excuse him in any way, shape or form. Equally, a state should not unburden itself of its moral responsibility by simply saying, oh, the terrorists are the bad guys, they are asking for it, therefore we can do whatever we want. No, quite the opposite. States should rise above it and combat terrorism more effectively with community outreach and intelligence and trust building in communities. Secondly, the speakers claim that in stressful circumstances, such as multiple suicide attacks in Afghanistan or Iraq, there's some kind of justification or need for state-sanctioned torture. Well, the last time I checked, state torture didn't reduce stress levels in a region or a country. In fact, they probably augment it rather a lot. And secondly, stress isn't a valid reason for acting in a certain way. It's potentially an excuse, but not a valid reason. In fact, allowing torture at times of high stress, when decisions have to be made about whether the torture is justified, how much torture to apply, whether the information you're gaining is good information or not, all of those things that you have to think about are things that you need to have quite a lot of time and peace to consider. Saying that you're only allowed to consider those matters in extremely stressful circumstances is counterproductive and would never work. And now on to my main point. And that is that the people who'd be making decisions about what circumstances torture is allowed to take place in, or exactly how much torture should be applied, the methods of torture, whether the information gained is reliable or not, would be making these decisions as human beings. We're not talking about robots who can magically come up with a formula and decide exactly the right way to go about torture. We're talking about people like you and I. More often than not in stressful circumstances where they're likely to make bad decisions. Also, given that these decisions will often lead to mistakes, the very nature of military operations being very secretive would mean these mistakes would often go unchecked and uncovered, and that would lead to massive violations of human rights across the board. So to muddy the water by saying, oh, in some cases torture is allowed, would mean that there would be more likely to be cover-ups in the military, and that we would have violations of human rights much more frequently, which would not go punished. So much easier to just say a blanket no. On a practical level, much easier just to say torture is never permissible. But maybe you'd say, well, we could have a set of guidelines, we could have some technocrats come up with a set of guidelines, and anybody who falls out of those guidelines in terms of torture would automatically be prosecuted. People within the guidelines would not. Well, who would come up with those guidelines? The state. We're talking about state-sanctioned torture. I could think of a few states right now who I wouldn't necessarily trust to come up with an idea of what justifiable state-sanctioned torture would look like. We could talk about North Korea, we could talk about Pol Pot's Cambodia, we could talk about Stalin's Russia, and we could talk about, obviously, Nazi Germany. The very motion implies that the state would make a decent decision in terms of when torture should and shouldn't be allowed, that the state is in some way benevolent and would only use it in the sort of circumstances where it's absolutely necessary to protect its citizens. Well, there are lots of examples of states which aren't benevolent, and for that reason, I don't think any state should necessarily be afforded the power to make these decisions at all. In fact, we've seen how journalists, civil society, and citizens themselves have often got to check the power of states, and therefore the power to sanction torture should never be one that's afforded to any state. And for that reason, I'm very pleased to speak for the opposition.